capital funding. Mr. Luckett.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. We are here to give you some information about capital funding, different options that we have as we go through our budget process for FY 2021. So I wanted to introduce to you, we have First Trine Advisors. This is our financial advisory group that's here with us. David Cheatwood and Tom Woodward are here, and I'll let them introduce themselves in just a moment. They have a brief presentation for you to kind of go over just how the city of Roswell looks financially in terms of our debt, some different options that we have for funding capital projects, and then I'll step back in and give you some next steps in the budget process. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to David Cheatwood.
Well, thanks, Ryan. Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to meet you all in person. Thanks for having us here tonight. As Ryan said, my name is David Cheatwood and my colleague Tom Woodward. We work at First Trine Advisors, and we're really happy to be the city's financial advisor. So we work with cities, towns, counties, utility systems, universities across the Southeast on financial planning, bond or debt issues. And so this is a really busy time of year for us because, like y'all, a lot of entities are going through the budget process, and so capital planning, capital funding is a hot topic, and so that's what Ryan asked us to come down and speak with you about tonight. You'll see in the material and what we go through, before we dive into any sort of capital planning discussion, we like to set the stage with where the city is in terms of your existing debt. It's really important to know where you are currently. If you have debt rolling off, maturing soon, naturally that creates capacity for new debt to be layered in there. So we want to give you a picture of your existing debt as well as your existing credit and credit ratings, kind of where y'all stand financially, how strong you are, how do you compare to some other entities out there. And then we wanted to walk through some of the different financing structures that the city has at its disposal as you consider some of these capital projects over the near and long term here. And then finally, we have a couple of sample scenarios and some information on a model we've been working with Ryan to put together for the city to help you kind of quickly and easily look at different capital options as you go forward. So I'm going to start with the city's outstanding debt. And so again, you'll see this in front of you as well as here. I know I have some numbers on the page, and so I'll highlight a couple of things here. Right now, the city has about $32.5 million of debt outstanding. It consists of a couple of different financing structures. You have two series of general obligation bonds that you've issued back in 2013 and 2014. About $6.5 million outstanding on those. You have a couple of installment sale agreements, various capital leases for fire trucks, ambulances, vehicles, as well as a GFA loan, the Georgia Environmental Finance Agency note for your water and sewer. So about $20 million on your general fund side or your primary government side, and then about $12.7 million on your business type, which is water and sewer. So that's your current debt outstanding. From an average coupon or interest rate, very low interest rates across the board, although I guess that's relative. Today, interest rates have kind of hit another all-time low, but very good position in terms of your existing interest rates out there. One of our jobs as financial advisors to look at those interest rates and see if there's any opportunity to refinance those for savings. I will tell you, for instance, on your 13 and 14 bonds, those are not eligible to be prepaid or refinanced, and so that's not something you would look at. And then you have various other ones out there that as you go forward, if you're looking at doing, for instance, a new capital lease, if there's a refinancing opportunity on some of your existing ones, we'll notify you of that and see if there's some debt service savings to be had there. In terms of your annual, so this is your principal amount outstanding. In terms of your debt service, principal and interest, what your structure looks like on your governmental side, on the top chart there, roughly $3.5 million of debt service per year for the current fiscal year 2020 out through fiscal year 2023. And then that dials back. You see some debt rolling off between 23 and 24, and then stepping it down again from 24 to 25. And so that's where this comes into play. That debt roll off naturally is going to create some capacity for you for new debt to fund some new projects. And at the end of this presentation, I've got an example of how you could layer on new debt and what your capacity is there. The bulk of that drop is your general obligation bonds. If I go back to your list of debt outstanding, you'll see that your 2013 GO bonds mature or paid off in fiscal year 2023, and then your 2014 is paid off in 2024. So for each of those bond issues, you did 10-year debt, and you can see how that falls off. And your water and sewer side, relatively low, a little under $1 million per year. That's longer-term debt. That goes out for the next 15 or so years. That's your current debt position. In terms of credit structure, you all have credit ratings right now in your general obligation bonds, your 13 and 14 bonds. So the way that works, if you issue public debt in the public market where you have official statement, you go out and sell it to a variety of investors, you get your bonds rated. There's 3 main rating agencies, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch. You have credit ratings from the first 2 of those, Moody's and Standard & Poor's, which is pretty typical. Not everyone has a Fitch rating. But you'll see highlighted your AAA from Moody's and AAA from S&P, the top ratings you can get. You haven't been looked at, hard over the last few years because you haven't been back to the market. You haven't issued new debt in the public market, but feel confident that you're in a really good position with that AAA rating today. Looking back at some of those older reports, some of the things they noted there in terms of strengths of the city, really strong, sizable tax base. You have some above average, those socioeconomic things like median family income. That's one of the main ones, income levels that rating agencies look at. Really strong financial position, especially on your reserves, your fund balance levels there. You have good formal fiscal policies. Your debt burden, very low. They call it manageable, but low debt burden there. And just a strong overall economy, which gives you good flexibility from a budgetary standpoint. Challenges, it's always hard for rating agencies to point out challenges for AAAs, but one they noted exposure to economically sensitive sales tax. Again, sales tax for most entities in Georgia is a good revenue stream there. And so, to the extent sales tax is impacted by things that we're seeing today, like the coronavirus, that sort of sensitivity is what they're talking about there. Factors that could lead to an upgrade, clearly not applicable because you're at the highest level. And then downgrade, if you started to see a drop in your financial reserves, or if you started to see some sort of structural imbalance in your budgeting process, you could see some downward pressure there. And so we want to note this because on the credit side, as you look at financing options, you may say, well, we have the cash, let's cash fund all these projects, which is fine, that's an option. But then we want to show you the impact. If you cash fund all those projects, what could happen to your credit rating? So you're not looking at or making decisions in isolation. You're taking it all into consideration. So if you do X, here's the impact, here's the Y impact, or here's another way to do it. If you do debt, your cash levels stay up, but your debt metrics go up. How does that impact things? It's really designed to help you, give you all the information you have, help you all make a well-informed decision about the path forward and the right debt versus cash mix for financing some of your projects or funding some of your projects. A lot of numbers here. I'm just going to highlight a couple. This is one thing we look at on the credit rating side is historical trends for different financial and debt ratios. And so this is pulled straight from a Moody's database here. And so they have various debt financial metrics. We've highlighted a couple. The debt metrics for all of them, frankly, your debt per capita is one item here. You'll note, and based on fiscal 19 data, $219 for debt per capita. The Georgia median for AAAs and then the national median for AAAs much higher. So y'all are in an incredibly low debt position. That's positive. You go to layer on new debt, you're not going to be out of step with some of the other highly rated entities as well. So low debt position. Financial statistics and ratios, I'll highlight the fund balance levels there, both total and unassigned. Looking at fiscal 19, about 40%. Moody's looks at it as a percentage of revenues. S&P looks at it as a percentage of expenditures. In many cases, those are very similar. But 40% general fund balance as a percentage of revenues based on your fiscal 19 audit. About 30% of that is unassigned. You're right in line with your Georgia peers, AAA peers, and also your national median there. That 40 and 30 is a good, very good, strong level. And again, things to keep in mind as you look to, hey, do we spend down some of these reserves? Do we build them up? What's the right level to be at? Cash, very strong cash position as well. And then you look at things we haven't highlighted, but it's not a coincidence that the other AAAs, both in Georgia and on the national side, if you look at some of those demographics, their per capita income, median family income above the U.S. levels there. And so that's one of the factors that comes into play on a credit rating. So that's your historical trend. In terms of those other Georgia peers out there, and you'll see how when we get to the capital planning model, we have all this built in so we can look at this easily and look at more peers if we wanted to here. But we're looking at a couple of things comparing your fiscal 19 financials to other peers across the state. Those other piers you'll see highlighted, and they're the teal bars. We've got some in the local area, some of the other AAAs like Sandy Springs, Johns Creek, Alpharetta, and Milton. Those are some of the AAAs. You have some of the AA1 and AA2, one notch and two notch below. So that's your peer group that we've put in here. If there's others you want to see, we can certainly add those in. If there's other national peers you want to see, we can add those in. But if you look at your fund balance level, total fund balance 40%, you'll see you're pretty much in line. You're towards the top on the total fund balance. Unassigned fund balance about 30%. You'll see you're right in line with those other AAA peers. They're all in that 30 to 35% level. Johns Creek a touch higher at 40% unassigned fund balance. Again, pulled straight from the Moody's database. But you're in good company there. The debt ratios, you'll see that you're at the low end, which is the good end from a debt perspective. Your debt as a percentage of assessed value and your debt per capita much lower than your other AAA highly rated peers across the state. Any questions on kind of debt or credit? Again, just really trying to set the stage as y'all look at some of your options down the road.
What's the difference, the rate difference between AAA and AA?
That's a good question. If you look at that differential, if you go down one rating notch, if you're at the top end of that spectrum, AAA to AA1, it's not a big difference. It's maybe 5 basis points, 0.05 of 1%. If you're going from a lower rating like A1 to A2, it may gap out a little bit to about 10 basis points. So the lower you go on the credit rating spectrum, the more one notch of a rating could impact it. But at the top end, it's about 5 basis points. In a market like this, where rates are incredibly low, outside of the last couple of weeks, credit spreads are pretty tight in general, so it's on the low end of that. No other questions? I'll talk a little bit about financing options here, or funding options, I should say. You've got a number of different options at your disposal here. The first, most tend to look at is what's my cash on hand? What are my fund balance levels? And so you all have various funds here, starting with your general fund being the biggest, but you have your T-SPLOST fund, capital projects fund, hotel, motel, impact fees, etc. So that's always a starting point. If you all can cash fund all your projects, still hit your fiscal policies, your minimum balance levels, fund all your projects, great, you kind of stop there if you can do that. In many cases, depending on the size of those projects, you're not going to be able to cash fund everything and still hit your metrics there. But you've got really good flexibility here, which is great. You have a lot of options. Other clients we have, they may not have this as an option. They're looking at debt funding for any sort of projects here. So you've got great flexibility. Now, some of those fund balances, or a lot of them outside of your general fund, they're limited to specific uses. You can't use T-SPLOST for just anything. It's got to be for road improvements. So there are restrictions, legal restrictions on what you can use some of those for. But that's where, when we get into looking at some of those projects, we're looking at repayment source, both revenues that are available, and also legally, what can you use? What sort of different revenue streams can you use to repay debt or to fund projects? But pay-go funding, your ongoing revenues, fund balance, that's certainly a funding option. If you can get grants, third-party funding sources, whether it's public-private partnerships or private funding, obviously a great source to go to. If it means you all aren't having to put up any additional funds. So I note those are out there for different types of projects where you may get approached from developers, hey, can you work with us on this? If you all fund infrastructure, can we do this? So those are questions you all might receive, and so that's something we always want to keep on the list and evaluate as those sort of questions and opportunities arise. And then last, that'll go through a little bit more detailed debt. You're going to have several different debt funding options here. Generally, those are your main ones. So let's talk about the last component, the debt piece of that. What are your different financing options here? And I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit of detail. General obligation bonds, that's kind of the first and foremost option that most entities will look towards. You also have what's called intergovernmental revenue bonds, sometimes called contract revenue bonds. I'll talk about those. Just other general revenue bonds. Lease purchase, certificates of participation, that's a financing vehicle out there for you. Capital leases as well, or something called tax allocation bonds. Different financing structures. We'll go through each of those. in turn here. Some of these you're clearly familiar with because you've done it before. But general obligation bonds, that's where you're pledging, city is pledging the full faith, credit, and taxing power. They can be issued for any purpose for which property taxes can be levied, but as you know, requires a voter referendum there. The advantages of a GO bond, it's going to be your highest credit rating, therefore it's going to be your lowest interest rate. It's also your simplest structure to put together and for investors to understand. So if you can do a GO bond, that's in many cases the way to go. You know, the disadvantages is with the voter referendum, it's just a longer lead time to get a project done. And so you've got to plan in advance when you want that referendum to hit and make sure you're hitting the legal steps and the lead up to that to enable you to issue that. And so that's the common weighing of, well, do we try to get to the market, try to bid our project sooner and do a non-GO, or do we go the GO route, which may take a little bit more time, but it's got voter input there. Intergovernmental revenue bonds or contract revenue bonds. So these are an indirect general obligation financing. You've got an authority, and this can be one of several different authorities, like a downtown development authority, an industrial development authority, public facilities authority. So there's an authority, and the city would enter into a contract. And so if it's for a facility, this authority would enter into a contract with the city for you all to use that, and you are making payments, facility payments under that contract. Those payments that you're making are backed by the full faith, credit, and taxing power of the city, but it's via a contract here, not via a general obligation bond. And so there's certain, you can't do every sort of project like this, and it depends on what your development authority is, what the legal provisions are for the authority, the different facilities or services they can provide. And so it's not a blanket, hey, well, let's just do one of these. It really depends on the type of authority and the type of facility you're looking to build or finance. Some of the advantages you would have if you issue this in the public market, it's the same rating as the GO bond because it's still, those contract payments are backed by the full faith, credit, and taxing power there. So same credit rating. That said, it's a slightly higher interest rate just because it reads revenue bond versus general obligation bond. Not material, 10 to 15 basis points typically between a GO bond and an intergovernmental revenue bond. No voter referendum required, so you tend to have a shorter time frame associated with that. It's also a very common structure in Georgia, so investors, rating agencies get it. Disadvantages, again, it's really bound by the terms of what the authority, if you have one, what's able to do. You have to create a new one, and so there's, again, you can only do it within the legal guidelines of that authority, so that limits certain projects. Revenue bonds. These revenue bonds, general category here, but it's basically any sort of revenue-producing project or enterprise system. You can pledge the revenues generated from that to finance a project. And so think, water and sewer. If you're doing a water and sewer project, you all can do a water and sewer revenue bond where you're pledging the water and sewer revenues. If you're doing a hotel-motel tax-supported deal, you can pledge your hotel-motel tax. So these are specific revenues that you're pledging. So you're not pledging your full faith, credit, and taxing power. Instead, you're pledging an identified revenue stream. So that's an option out there. You can do that for most revenue-producing projects. Does not require a voter referendum unless it's for gas or electric, which does not apply to y'all. In terms of the advantages, also very straightforward structure. It's going to be a little bit higher credit rating than a GO or an intergovernmental revenue bond, but still a very credit-worthy structure, although it does depend on what the revenue stream is. Water and sewer, essential service, if you have good coverage, your revenues cover your debt service by a good amount, it's a very credit-worthy structure. If it's not as strong of a revenue stream, lower coverage, sometimes that can bring the rating down. So the rating and therefore the interest rate really depends on the strength of the revenue pledge. But it's a very, again, it's a straightforward structure. Investors, rating agencies understand it. Lease purchase or certificates of participation typically mean the same thing here, but they are multi-year contracts, leases, lease purchase contracts that are out there. It is for property to be acquired, and so these can be for hard asset type facilities here. They're typically for the full cost of the project, so you're not going to do a little piece of it. as a financing and cash fund the rest. It's the full project. You are limited in terms of the amount of the lease purchase or COPS debt you can have outstanding. And the difference between a lease purchase and a COP, if it's a COP, there's typically a third-party intermediary involved, a trustee, or money flows through them to the bondholder, and so otherwise they're very similar there. It doesn't require legislative action or creation of an authority, but it's only for certain types of projects. And revenues, requires the pledge of the asset as collateral for lease purchase or COP, typically a higher interest cost as well. Tax allocation bonds, this is just really a financing structure that allows to enhance or facilitate development. And so these are paid, secured for by incremental ad valorem property taxes that are created in a special specified tax allocation district. Again, not available to everybody out there, typically used for public infrastructure to help aid in development, but that's something that's out there. To the extent an opportunity arises where you wanted to do that, you would set up that tax allocation district and use revenues that are created above and beyond this baseline tax value to help repay that debt service. More complicated structure, typically less credit worthy because it's dependent on that development happening to generate that additional property tax revenue, and so with all that comes a higher interest rate. So that covers the types of financings that are out there. In terms of where you would issue that, the different markets you have at your disposal, you've got public market, which I've talked about. That's where you have a credit rating, you have an offering document, an underwriter sells it to a variety of different investors, mutual funds, insurance companies, et cetera. With the public sale, you have a higher upfront cost of issuance, a little bit more on the staff time commitment side because you're putting that offering document together, that disclosure document, getting them rated, getting the bonds rated. But you have really good flexibility in terms of how you structure that debt. You can also sell debt directly to a bank. So the bank is your bondholder, your lender. You don't have a credit, you don't have an offering document. You don't have a credit rating there. The city's done both. You've got your publicly sold bonds with your GOs. You've also done bank placed debt with your capital leases and some of your installment sale agreements there. What's not noted, so you have public market bank, or you have this other third party kind of catch-all. That could be in the form of the Georgia Environmental Finance Authority, GEFA. It can be through GMA, it can be through USDA. So there's these other third-party sources that can help finance this debt. So it's not just limited to public market bank placed. Those other third parties are more similar to bank placed because you don't have the offering document, the credit ratings, et cetera. You really have a direct lender instead of a bank. It's just one of these other sources out there. These are really viable alternatives. Y'all have taken advantage of that before with some of your existing debt. There's a couple different types of sale methods. You can either sell debt competitively, which means you open it up to all underwriters or banks to bid on, or you can sell it negotiated, where you select a bank up front, bank or underwriter up front, and you negotiate the interest rate with them. You all have done back in 13 and 14 through GeoBonds competitive sales. Those are really good. They fit well with issuers who are either in the market frequently, have a really high credit rating, and there's not a story behind it. If it's a GeoBond for a AAA, that's kind of right down the middle for everybody. They get it, they understand it. Fits really well with a competitive issue. If you're doing a tax allocation bond and you really need the underwriter or bank to understand it, that's when in many cases a negotiated financing makes sense because you bring that underwriter on board early on, you explain the deal for them, they understand it, and they're the ones that are selling it. So a couple of different options for you. It really depends on the type of financing we have. So those are the different financing options. When we get to talking about projects down the road, we start with two main questions. You tell us the project, we're going to look, one, at repayment source. What are your different repayment sources? How can you pay for that? How much can you afford? And then the other question is, what's the financing structure? And so with that second question, as we just went through, we may be able to tell you, well, you can finance this project one of two or three different ways. Here are the different options. We'll remind you of the pros and cons, the different interest rates that are associated with it. So we're really looking at two different things when we're evaluating financing a particular project. So moving on to this last section, capital planning. And so this is one of the first things we've been doing with the city in our role as financial advisor. And so I've been working with Ryan a lot on this over the last couple of months. We developed kind of within our firm what we very unoriginally call our capital planning model. If you go back several years, what we used to do, you would tell us a particular project, we'd come to you and say, here's the debt service on a 10-year financing at a 3% rate, here's how you can do it. Inevitably, you all would say, well, what if we move that project back 2 years? What if it's another $5 million? What if we extended it to 20 years? How does this impact our credit rating? So over the years, we wanted to find a more efficient way to really look at these types of projects, answer these types of questions. And so as it's evolved, we built this model, and we're still in the process of finalizing it with Ryan. But you'll see it's got a couple of different inputs and a couple of different outputs. We have some screenshots for you. It's an Excel-based model. It's designed to be really interactive, dynamic. We pull it up in a lot of sessions just like this, work sessions where we'll say, here's one funding plan. If you do all of these projects at these amounts, this timing, here's what this would do to your different financial or debt metrics. And then you all may say, well, let's turn that project off. Let's move that back a couple of years. Let's increase the amount. And so we can just turn a button on, turn it off, it flows through and gives you all that information live. It really helps with helping prioritize projects, kind of generate a consensus on the path to move forward, and also shortens the time frame for doing all that, because we're in this sort of session instead of saying, all right, well, let us go back and run it. We'll be back in 2 weeks and we'll show you what it looks like. And so we found it to be very helpful. The things we're putting into it are a lot of things that we've already talked about. Your existing debt, we absolutely load that up so we can see where it rolls off. Your credit profile, we want to load that in as well. Your financial performance, both historical and projected. And then, most importantly, the last piece we typically drop in, your capital improvement plan, or it can just be your project wish list. It may not be a formalized CIP, but there's these other projects that you have in mind. How do you fund those? So we're dropping those in. What we're focused on the right-hand side, your outputs, what's the impact on the tax rate, the revenue stream that we're looking at? What's the impact on your fund balance if you're looking at cash funding projects? On a projected revenue and expenditure performance, we can look at sensitivity of those. Are you still complying with your financial policies and targets? And then how do you look from a credit rating aspect of peer comparison? So all things we've built into this model. A few screenshots here. I may come up here to the front. And this is something we'll be back in front of you again at a later date to really pull this up and to get into some of the details. But what you'll see here is you have some on-off switches where you're going to be able to load up all your different projects you're focused on or want to evaluate. If you turn it off, it's going to gray out. It's going to come out of the model completely. If you turn it on, it's going to show in white and it'll flow through the model. And so it's really quick and easy to look at different projects turned on, look at different amounts, look at different timings, and where you start to get some of the functionality under that column 6 is how do we fund that? What's the fund or revenue source we want to focus on here? Is it out of our debt service fund with debt service millage? Is it out of our hotel motel tax fund? Is it out of motor vehicle tax? So it allows you to look and say, well, I want to leverage this revenue stream. Or maybe I only want to do $2 million out of that revenue stream. Let me do the rest out of this other one. And so it really gives you some good functionality and helps you find the right mix of debt, cash, and also the funding source there. It also allows you to look at different funding types, as I mentioned, debt, cash. If it's debt, what type of debt? Is it GO bonds? Is it a lease purchase? If it's debt, what's the structure? Is it 10 years at 3%? Is it 20 years at 4%? Do you want to defer principal? Do you want to customize your repayment schedule? All of that's built in to this model on this main kind of dashboard or landing page here. Some of the metrics, don't expect you to actually see these. These are sample screenshots here. We're able to look at your debt service structure, kind of new debt in teal. Existing debt in teal, new debt stacked onto it. So visually you can see, well, here's where my debt service is going up. This is why I need to increase property tax, or this is why I can decrease property tax, or this is where this new revenue stream is coming online. If it's fund balance, what are my fund balance levels? What is that as a percentage of revenues or expenditures? How does that compare to target? Moody's credit rating, we have this, it's a little tachometer built in, and so we can project out if you go and issue X, Y, and Z, how does that impact your credit rating? Does it go even stronger on the AAA? Do you have some downside pressure? So it's really like a warning light, or it can tell you have some upside. In your case, no upside, you're already at AAA. But it's a really good barometer because, as I mentioned, you don't want to look at something in isolation. You want to see what the impact is on things like credit rating. If you're looking at a revenue stream like water and sewer, we're looking at coverage levels. So all of that's built in to this model. Certainly not going to see this. These are numbers that we're working on with Ryan in terms of projections, kind of fund balance projections. We're looking at different financial ratios. If something, these are all examples. If something goes below a target, it will red flag. It'll tell you you're below it. You may say that's okay to be below it for a year or two if I come right back above it a few years later. But all of it's built in, so as, again, you turn a project on or off, it'll highlight the results automatically there. Where we're spending some time with Ryan on, because the model's only as good as the numbers we're projecting, I'm on page 26 here, projected revenues and expenditures. And so for all of your different funds out there, we're working with Ryan to say, we can build out your historical revenues and expenditures, but on a projected basis, what are reasonable growth assumptions here? Property tax revenue has been growing at a faster pace than sales tax revenues. What are projections for hotel motel? We have new hotels coming online in a couple of years. Do we need to show an uptick in those? And so that's where we're spending some time, because we need those revenue and expenditure projections so that we can see you can afford new debt. Can you cash fund a project? We need to evaluate your fund balance levels going forward. And all of these are not meant to be static. We're not going to look at them once and be done with them. We see this as a dynamic model where each and every year at a minimum, once you're done with your, you've audited your financials, we're going to drop those in. From the budget process, you're going to look at the next year's growth assumptions. Are those still realistic? Has something happened over the course of the last year where we need to dial those back or increase them? And so that's where we see that kind of back and forth to make sure that these don't go stale. They're obviously based on best estimates and certain assumptions here, but we want to continually look at those and make sure if things have changed, we want to change the projection so y'all are aware of that. You can change your capital planning needs accordingly. This is some of the screenshots that we went through on your peer comps here. And this is built into the model. And so as you issue debt, what you may see is on some of these debt metrics, if I turn on a lot of debt for you, what the model will show is, well, here's where you are now, here's where you're going if you follow this funding plan, if you issue this debt, and here's how you stack up. And so you can see the before and after picture to say, you know what, if I cash fund all my projects and my fund balance goes down, do I still stack up well to my peers? You get that kind of extra level of comfort if you're still looking solid versus your peers. Same on the debt metrics. All of it, again, under one roof. You turn one and it flows through all the different metrics there. If you're looking at things like water and sewer, you may look at days cash on hand or fund balance, coverage levels on different peers as well. This is what I was mentioning on the credit rating side. So we built, one thing that came out of the recession in the late 2000s were the rating agencies, Moody's and Standard & Poor's, very transparent in how they rate you now. Here are the different factors. Here are the ratings assigned to each factor. That enables us to basically replicate your credit rating. We know the different factors out there. We know your values, so we put them in. And that allows us to then project out, if you follow a funding plan over the next 5 years, how does that affect your credit rating? And so there's certain metrics, debt metrics, fund balance metrics, that directly tie to your financial projections and your funding plan. So we can say, you know what, here's where you are now. If you do all of these over the next 5 years, you're still projected to be AAA. So that's just another added bell and whistle we've started to load into these capital planning models. One thing Brian suggests we do, just from a visual, a little bit of a teaser, if you will, in terms of your different debt capacity out there and within the confines of this capital planning model, is to talk about debt capacity and show you a scenario or two, or how we would go about looking at this and relaying it to you. So right now, with those 2013 and 2014 general obligation bonds outstanding, you all levy 0.25 of 1 mil, quarter of a mil, to repay that debt service. If we wanted to look at that same 0.25 of a mil, let's say we kept that in place, if those bonds paid off, this is your existing debt service. If those bonds paid off, they pay off in 2024, technically your debt service millage would roll off or go down from 23 to 24 because you don't have as much GO debt to pay, therefore you don't need to levy that millage. And it would go off completely in 24. If you wanted to keep that $0.25 outstanding, what could that generate? What sort of capacity could that generate? The factors that come into play there are the term. Do you want to issue that as 10-year debt, 15-year debt, 20-year debt? The answer changes, or the answer to that question changes the result, as does the interest rate, somewhat to a lesser extent. But if we looked at a 20-year borrowing, and we kept your debt service at approximately $1.6 million per year, which is where it is now, at that $0.25 you all could fund a little over $20 million from a GO bond. If you wanted to go out 30 years, you could fund more. If you wanted to go out 10 years, it'd be less. But that's the kind of back and forth we can turn on and look at those different assumptions live and come to a number, if that's a path you wanted to go down, the GO bond and the referendum, come to a number that you're comfortable with. But that's the capacity there. You will have a little bit of fund balance in that debt service fund, and so you'll see if you issue that debt in fiscal 21, your debt service would hit in fiscal 22. That shows an increase in your debt service. So you would think, all right, well, we got to increase taxes to cover that. You have a little bit of fund balance in your debt service fund that it has accumulated over the last couple of years. So you could use that, that's in the bottom right, to offset that, so you wouldn't have to increase your property tax millage to pay for that. And we could defer principal for 3 years until we started to get some more capacity out here. So all that, we can look at those different assumptions and get to a place where we can say, all right, you have $20 million of capacity. If you follow this plan, as those underlying assumptions change, our result's going to change as well. But a few screenshots on that side from a GO bond debt service millage assumption. Another one, if we looked at a non-GO or a non-property tax-backed scenario, we just picked one to be kind of simple and easy here. If you looked at how much could your motor vehicle and rental tax fund from a bond offering here. And so based on your fiscal 19 data, are estimated to produce about $300,000 per year in that, in terms of annual revenues coming in. So if we leverage that $300,000, how much could we borrow? Again, depends on the term of the debt, but if you went out 10 years at an estimated interest rate, you could generate about $2.6 million. If you went out 15 years, it goes up about $1 million to 3.7. If you went out with 20-year debt, about 4.5. And then these, again, are all screenshots from the model to tell you, here's your debt service picture. If we max that out totally, we want to use 100% of that $300,000. Here's how much we could borrow. Also within the model, you can say, well, let's not use all $300,000. Let's only use $200,000. Let's leave $100,000 for pay-go projects or otherwise. We just tell that to hit a different target, will give us a different output here. So I wanted to give you a couple of different scenarios. As you all are going through your budget process, you're looking at your different projects to fund over the long term. Kind of keep this in the back of your head that we've got this. We're happy to pull this up live, look at different either set assumptions, or you all hit us with different scenarios and we can look at those, evaluate those. I wanted to at least set the stage for a later discussion within the confines of this capital plan. That Ryan covered what we wanted to cover, but I know went through a lot there. Happy to take any questions you have.
Sarge.
I just have a quick question. What contributes to the fund balance, the balances that end up in the fund balance? Or
Why do you have those?
Yes.
So with for instance, in your debt service fund, you all levy 0.25 of a mil for that. It's an estimate when you're going out, so many times the value of a mil is a little bit higher, collections come in a little bit higher.
That's just
So it's just a build-up. Most entities rightfully tend to be conservative on the estimated value of the mill because they don't want to be short with those revenues coming in. So you tend to see a little bit of a balance come up on that. And then your other fund balances, of course, would just build up as you have revenues.
Thank you.
Can you flip back to page 4 for a moment? So while you do that, thanks for the presentation. It's really interesting to see everything this way, and thanks for the explanation of funding versus debt, because they're certainly different methodologies. I think what I want to share is, debt is not bad if used correctly. And what I'm struggling a little bit with is when I look and try and understand what our capital structure is of the city of Roswell, it's not clear to me what ideal would be. So I would kind of work this thing backwards and say, here's what an ideal capital structure would look like for us. I'm a big fan of matching. So I like to match revenues with expenditure. And so if I'm going to build let's just say I'm going to build a fire station that's going to last 30 years. Putting 10-year financing on a 30-year fire station says that the people who live here in the first 10 years are going to pay for all that fire station. And the people that live here in years 10 or 11 through 30 get the fire station free. Okay, that's one easy way to look at it. And so and that's kind of what we've been doing in the past. And so when I look at this chart in particular, right, I'm struggling with the top one, right, because that's not really an ideal capital structure to have, right, where, we take on a random number of years worth of debt and then pay it off and then do it again and then pay it off. Because what winds up happening is we wind up starving the community, right? Because unless we have the cash now, or unless it's in those first 10 years, even though the project might be, 20, 30 years long, its estimated life, right? We haven't done it. And as a result, the list of what we haven't done is really, really long, right? And so before I would want to put out a list of projects, right, I'd kind of like to understand if I wanted to maintain the AAA or a AA credit rating, because based on what you told us, 5 basis points really doesn't make any difference, right, to go from A to. So if I wanted to stay in that range, right, and I had sort of an ideal capital structure of some amount of 30 and some amount of 20 and some amount of 10, what are those numbers and what would they look like that would keep me in those ranges? I'm less concerned, because what I'd like to do is then go to our citizens and say, okay, here's the things that you've all asked for, and it's a great big number. Here are the ways we can give it to you. And I think what I think the numbers will show is that we have a lot of capacity to do a lot of the things that we haven't done for the last, whatever number of years. The best example I can give you is sidewalks. We have a list of $43 million worth of sidewalk. This is interconnecting, not necessarily in a neighborhood, but interconnecting. We do out of operating funds between $500,000 and $1 million a year. So that means we're between 43 and 86 years behind in construction, right? Our operating fund will never get us where we want to get, so it's a great item to go to citizens and say, a normal backlog might be 20 years. So to fill that gap, here's how much we would like to add. And sidewalks last, 20 years. So that chunk is 20-year debt. Here's what we'd like to see you approve. But I have a hard time getting there because I don't know kind of what that ideal capital structure should look like.
Right.
I think your model will get us there.
It will absolutely tell you if we load up, and you'll see the sensitivity of it. If we pulled it up and we loaded up $20 million of debt, does that impact your credit rating? $100 million. And so you can see the extremes. What I'll tell you is from doing a lot of these, it normally takes, especially where you're starting, it takes a lot of debt to really move your credit rating down. Because as you saw, with a lot of those other AAAs, they have a lot more debt. So you would have to issue a lot to kind of get out of comparison with those.
The other output that I think would be great to have come out of the model is for the average home, which I think in Roswell is $325,000. What would the tax rate change at each sort of level of debt? So if I took out 25 million, if I took out 50, if I took out 75, if I took out 100, whatever those numbers are. Because I think that helps people to understand the impact of something like this. So it's really both of those things. It's what is it going to cost the individual, right? But how much of this giant list of things that we'd like to get done can we actually do and stay within a reasonable financial framework, including not just amount of borrowing, but term, right? Because that again, that top one it just strikes me as
Yeah, and
odd.
part of that is, you all do have a number of capital leases out there for things like fire trucks, ambulances, which do tend to have a shorter average life. I mean, those are useful life, I should say. Some of those, fire trucks, depends on if it's a big ladder truck or smaller one, but maybe 10 to 15 years for those. And so you tend to do, and that's not an insignificant amount of your debt is some of those types of vehicles out there. I don't remember, Ryan, I guess we have Parks and Rec fire station for 13 and 14 GOs. And so, yeah, certainly on the fire station side, typically longer useful life. But that's the matching, is trying to find, yes, useful life, you can go long. Do you all, and this is where the benefit of the model really comes in, because again, historically, you all may say, hey, we have this one project, how do we finance it? Now we want to say, well, what do you have behind it? Like, we just don't want to look at it in isolation, because if we went and issued long-term debt, 30-year debt, and then 2 years later we say, well, now we want to do this too, well, we'd say, well, it would have been great to know that and to structure the first one. So this sort of planning allows you to lay it all out and look at it as a group, as a whole, and not just in isolation.
Right. So I think if those two things could come out, sort of what's that optimal structure for a city our size, right? And then what do the various levels cost the average, homeowner?
Yep.
Yeah. Once you hit that optimal level.
Right.
And then if we don't want to go that far, we don't have to. If you want to go a little further, you can certainly do that. But it gives you kind of a steady state, rather than here's a list of projects. Tell me which ones we can do.
Yeah, we can go either or both directions. Any other?
Additional questions, comments from council? Mr. Luckett, do you have additional comments?
I do. I had a couple things to wrap up, if you don't mind.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
We just wanted to provide this information to you all just to kind of set some context for you as we think through the budget process in the coming months. Kind of where we're at today. So departments have submitted their proposals for the FY 2021 capital budget. So those items that we would want to fund in the upcoming year, but also those major capital projects which we know wouldn't really be a decision that would be made during the budget process because it would take a lot of this analysis and things like that. So our process will follow the same process we always have. We'll present this information to the mayor, and then the proposed budget that she comes up with will be presented on May 11th to you all. Our suggestion would be then to, the budget itself will include those items that we can fund immediately for FY 2021. But then we would recommend maybe coming back to you all after that to continue this discussion on some of those major capital projects that we know kind of require longer discussion, longer analysis, longer time frame for consideration. So knowing that, that's kind of what we would recommend. Thinking through that though, obviously there's lots of different funding sources, as David had mentioned, whether it's cash, whether it's grants, whether it's financing. Because of the long time frame associated with a bond referendum itself, this particular example, I did just want to give you some basic guidelines just to keep in the back of your mind as we move forward in terms of timelines. So obviously there's only certain dates, election dates, that are eligible for bond referendum. Part of that, the role that the council would play obviously is deciding what projects would be a part of that referendum, what amounts that would be, the term of the financing. So that's all encapsulated in a bond referendum resolution, which you all would have to enact before that process would move forward. There is a deadline associated with that. So for even number election years, that bond referendum resolution has to be approved by the council at least 100 days prior to the election. In odd number election years, that time window is about 70 days prior to the election. And so just to give you an idea of what that looks like, these are all the dates over the next few years that are eligible election dates for a bond referendum. So we show you there, starting in 2020, the next one would be that we would be even have the time frame for would be November, all the way through 2025. And then on the far right column, you see kind of what our rough estimated deadline would be in terms of when we have to have final approval by the city council. So obviously, before final approval, we would be having lots of discussion, public input, in deciding what that project list would look like. So just some other information for you to give you an idea of what that time frame looks like.
Yes, I did. I thought that the bonds going to referendum, is there typically a term that you would go out for a vote? Would they run with a bond for referendum? Like, it looks like we have typically done a 10-year bond. Can you go, do you typically go out further?
Yes,
So
I
that
think
is
we're,
possible, that's
the state I think allows us to go out 30 years as our max. And obviously I think that's what Councilmember Tizer was referencing. And something that we would be considering is, trying to match the term of the debt to the useful life of whatever it is that would go to.
Just wondering if the states have limits on what that term might be.
Right, just the 30 years is what we're limited at here in Georgia. So those are all the dates for your consideration. And then just to wrap things up, so these are the remaining dates, some of the key dates for the budget process. So our next budget work session is on March 23rd, where the partner organizations will be here to present. As I mentioned, the proposed budget presentation is scheduled for May 11th. The next day, we have a special called work session where the departments will be presenting their individual budgets to you all from 12 to 4. And then later that same day, at 6 o'clock, we have our public hearing for the millage rate, which this is the particular hearing we're required to have between 6 and 7 o'clock. May 26th would be our first reading, and June 8th would be our second reading. So with that, that concludes our presentation. Any other questions we can answer for anybody?
Thank you, Mr. Luckett.
Okay, thank you very much.
Additional questions, comments from council? I just have one question.
Just on the matching, when you're looking at that, is that useful life, or how do other cities do it when they issue the bonds?
In terms of matching, are you talking about term to the, or more term or more revenue matching the?
More term, what Councilman Tizer was talking about. I'm not thinking in terms of GAAP and accounting in a traditional sense, so.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that we'll start with, and it's really more of a tax question, is you can't go beyond the useful life, or it's normally 120%, I think, of the useful life of the asset. So you can't take a police car and finance it over 20 years. You're not allowed to there. And so you start with the useful life. A lot of the projects you're considering do have really long useful lives. And so that's typically not a concern for a lot of things, unless we're talking about vehicles or ambulances or things like that. But if you're doing fire stations, road, street improvements. Sometimes road and street improvements are a little bit shorter, but you start with that from a useful life perspective. But then, it's really different entity to entity. Others will take the view, hey, we want to issue debt, but we want to pay it off quickly because we know we're going to have another round of projects 5 years later and we can layer it right on top. Others will say, hey, this is a really long, useful asset. I want all citizens to pay for this over a 30-year time frame, as the councilman was suggesting earlier. So there's not a right or wrong answer other than that useful life question, kind of a tax answer. It really just depends on how you want to layer it in and your other projects down the road.
Okay, thank you.
Any additional questions or comments? Thank you, gentlemen. We are adjourned.
Thanks a lot.